from Tennessee. Does that make sense? So like most of the other guys, if I remember correct, Jackson's from Tennessee. Hickory, yeah, pretty sure. Yeah, and he's also, if I remember correctly, the first non-Virginian also. So some of these arguments that they have, like, and that you can clearly see in the video about how do we prevent the large states from overruling others, they're legitimate concerns, right? How do we deal with this? How do we create a system of government that is not just ruled by the mob, that is not just ruled by the wealthy, but that it's ruled by everybody? But do we really want everybody to have a say in this? The vast majority of Americans are uneducated. So do we really want this uneducated populace voting? If the uneducated populace is voting, that's problematic. Because they could potentially elect somebody who should not be president of the United States, who has no business being in that position whatsoever at all, okay?
Like a guy running from jail.
Yeah.
With a donut.
Or, I'm going to move on because I'll say something I shouldn't say. So, how do we do this, right? And so ultimately we see we've got Washington there, we've got Benjamin Franklin there, Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution, arrives after the Annapolis Convention. Fine, if we're going to have to rewrite it, I guess I'll show up. But ultimately, this becomes the question, and what do we deal with small states versus large states, okay? Understand this about the Constitution. The Constitution is built on a series of compromises, okay? In fact, there are 5 compromises that will ultimately create the Constitution. So it's not like they were able to just sit down and write it out. In fact, they had to, it was based on compromise, okay? And it's probably one of the things that makes our Constitution really, quite frankly, very strong. The other thing that makes our Constitution incredibly strong is that, as Everett pointed out when they were reading through some of those basic things at the very end of our video, it is incredibly vague in some areas, okay? But they understood something fundamentally. They got that our Constitution would have to change over time as our country changed and as people changed. And if you made it too rigid, it would fail just like the Articles of Confederation did. So how do we create something that can change over time? And ultimately, that also means that it's a document that is up for interpretation. Good or bad, it is a document that is interpreted on a regular basis as to what it means. Does that make sense? Okay. And what does it mean for that matter to have the right to keep and bear arms? In a country in which the Constitution is written, it is vital to be able to have your own weapon, because how else do you eat? Anything other than a plant-based diet, right? You need to own a gun so you can go out and shoot a deer. Or quite frankly, if you do own cattle, that's how you're killing your cattle or whatever else, right? Before you butcher it. So, like, it is critical for that meat. In today's world, the guns that we have are drastically different than the guns that were available when the Constitution was ratified. So does it mean that that interpretation is different now than what it was at the time? Does that make sense? And the founding fathers understood that there would be changes in how that's interpreted over time based on those ideas, based on technological change, based on just in general society changing. The vast majority of the people sitting in this classroom probably do not hunt. Is there anybody in here that actually does go hunting? Okay? Now, if you were to, if you were not to live in North Dakota, let's say you lived in New York, how many people do you think in the classroom would be hunters?
None.
Probably none, maybe one if you're lucky, right? Like, I mean, part of the reason why there are a larger percentage of hunters is because you live in the state of North Dakota. Okay? At the same time, we don't generally have an issue with gun violence in North Dakota. Right? But in New York, do they have a larger issue with gun violence?
Chicago has like
or Chicago, or whatever. But again, in Chicago, do you think people, like students sitting in a Chicago classroom are going hunting
Hunting for each other.
on the weekend? Probably not, unless it's something like that. But they understood that, right? And they understood the complexity of that. But it also made it incredibly difficult to come up with an agreement as to what to do, right? Do we make this document rigid? Do we make it flexible? How do we honor the needs of the small states and the big states at the same time? The first compromise comes to deal with the big state versus small state issue, okay? Virginia, as proposed by Madison, argues that we are going to have this bicameral legislature. The lower will be based on population. They will be elected every 3 years. The upper will be equitable. And it will, it will also be based on population, but they will be elected every 7 years instead of every 3 years like the lower house. They believed that the legislature should choose the judiciary branch and that the judiciary branch would serve 7 years, but would only get 1 term in office. Does that make sense? So your judiciary would rotate out every 7 years. They also believed then that the legislature should also choose the executive branch of the government and put those people in place, and that they too would only serve 1 term of 7 years. Now the problem is, if you have the upper house rotating out every 7 years, the judiciary rotating out every 7 years, and the executive rotating out every 7 years, every 7 years, what's gonna happen?
The big elections.
Newbies come in.
A huge group of new people are gonna come in. Does that make sense? Okay? Instead of just maybe a few, but there's gonna be a lot of people that come in, okay? They believe that the Constitution should allow for settlement between states, but they still believed that there should be no ability of the federal government to tax or to regulate trade between the states. That should be a right of the state themselves. New Jersey was written by William Patterson. Patterson believed that the federal government should be able to regulate import taxes, so taxes coming on imports. He also believed that the federal government should pass a Stamp Act.
What?
What? Okay, yeah, Stamp Act, okay? He also believed that the federal government should be there to regulate trade between states and force states who are delinquent on paying off debts to other states to do so. They also believed that each state should only get 1 vote, okay, and that it should, of course, be equitable amongst the states themselves, okay? There are other plans that go into this when it comes to the legislature. Hamilton believed that legislators should serve for life as long as they were on good behavior, so that their way they would not be based off of the will of the people, but they would do what was best for the government, not just for like their party or what their voters wanted them to do. Connecticut believed that there should be more proportional representation, and they also argued that it should be different based on the 2 different houses, okay? So proportional in one and equitable in the other. It is not until July, so we begin in May. July is when we finally reach a compromise when it comes to this part of it, okay? We are going to create 3 different branches, okay? The House of Representatives will be elected by the people. It is based on population. They will rotate in every 2 years. Large states are happy with this. Does that make sense? There's another piece that will come with this here in a minute. But on the other side, we will have Senate. The Senate originally, the members of the Senate are elected by the state's Congress. Does that make sense? So it is not the people of the state that represent the senators or elect the senators, okay? That does not happen until the passage of the 17th Amendment, which gives us the direct election of senators.
What year?
let's see, it's during the progressive era, so 19 teens,
Really?
somewhere in there, yep.
Seems like so long, like, so before it was just state representatives, like people elect the state.
Yeah, so you elect your state representatives, your
Yep.
state representatives,
Which, like,
or senators elect your national.
And the state representatives come from like different like counties or districts, like the different ones, right?
Yeah. Can you shut off the recording?
Sure.